And welcome to this talk, Implementation Trumps What, Even in a Crisis, where I'm going to look at approaching sustained remote teaching. In terms of what this session will cover in more detail, I'm going to start with arguing for implementation, relatively unsexy in the world of evidence-informed practice and its relevance even in a time of crisis. We're going to look at key points for implementing remote teaching, viewed through the eyes of the EEF Guide to Implementation, and then I'm going to finish by talking about why I think we ain't done with careful implementation of remote teaching, even 2 months into the school closure crisis. So, as I said, I'm director of Norwich Research School, one of 32 research schools sponsored and linked to the EEF in the country. We are actually Norwich Notre Dame High School, and we're a school like any other learning. So we've been through the same pain, I'm sure, in terms of dealing with the pandemic, school closures, and the ongoing uncertainty facing us. Before the crisis, we had worked hard as a school, as a research school, to define our key behaviours for being a research school, so that we'd hope to walk the walk as an evidence-informed school and be able to exemplify for others. And that broke down into all sorts of things. So it broke down into our leadership team walking the walk and modelling the use of evidence for everyone else in the school. It was all about filtering and shaping our approaches and our policies, making spending decisions that are evidence-informed, designing and implementing a curriculum, and championing pedagogy that's evidence-informed. Very relevant to today's talk, following the guidance from the EF and other sources of evidence on how to implement change effectively, considering what the evidence has to say about effective CPD for our own staff and, of course, the training we offer others, and also evaluating what we change so that we know whether it works or not, really, obviously crucial. Now, it'd be easy to sort of drop all of that in a time of crisis, and I'll be honest with you, initially, in the very short time that we had until schools were closed, there was a bit of scrambling around, and we did drop a few things in order to survive. But this talk is really an argument to say that although implementation can sound rather dry, it's not only quite the opposite, but it's also essential to implement in an informed, staged and considered manner, even when you've not got much time on your hands. And we feel like we've learnt that when it comes to remote teaching. When the EF Toolkit was initially released, Professor Steve Higgins, one of the contributors, talked about the Bananarama effect. So the song, "It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it." If you look at the Teaching and Learning Toolkit online now, of course, at the top, if you rank by effect size, you have things like feedback and metacognition. So you could quickly say, okay, we need those things underpinning our remote teaching strategy as a school. But if you scroll further down, there's what seems like an anomaly, learning styles, debunked by research. We no longer necessarily think there's any point in trying to teach the learning styles. Read Kirshner's work for more interest on that, the recent book, very good at dissecting learning styles and their fallacies, but it stays there on the Teaching and Learning Toolkit as plus 2 months effect size. An argument why that might be, if the studies that feed into the Teaching and Learning Toolkit are valid and reliable, is that although learning styles may be debunked, perhaps when we implement things carefully, the process of thinking carefully, monitoring carefully, evaluating carefully can help to improve teachers' practice and therefore outcomes for students. So it ain't what you do. Sometimes it's the way that you do it. And actually, we started with our remote teaching approach by thinking carefully about how we're going to implement things in a staged manner. Going back to the idea that it ain't what you do, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. You break down individual meta-analyses that feed into the Teaching and Learning Toolkit strands, you see there's a very wide range of impacts for any strand, feedback, metacognition, you name it. And there's this classic quote used by Dylan William a lot about feedback, that 38% of studies into feedback actually had a negative impact on students' learning. We don't really want to be in that category when it comes to delivering remote teaching. Things are going to be hard enough if we implement things poorly, just because we've stuck feedback into part of our remote teaching offer, just because we've tried to implement cognitive strategies. If they're implemented badly, if our teachers don't understand them, if our students don't understand them, we could do more harm than good. So we went here first, the school's guide to implementation, when it came to thinking about remote teaching. And it's often that guidance report, best evidence synthesis, if you like, is often explored through this four-step process of implementing change, where actually the argument is that schools traditionally rush, explore and prepare and get too quickly to deliver and sustain, and then things aren't delivered well or sustained long term. So we tried to slow ourselves down and give ourselves breathing space to explore and prepare what we were going to do with regards to remote teaching. So I'm going to walk you through those four stages now. The first thing is explore, where we define the problem that faces us and identify appropriate programs or practices to implement. Now, at first glance, the problem caused by school closures is obvious, but you need to be able to tightly define what the problems specifically are for learners, teachers, and other stakeholders if you want to get a tight implementation in response. So what we did in order to pause and learn more and explore was initially put up a relatively simple offering to students and a relatively simple ask from our teachers with regards to remote teaching. So, for example, setting work in weekly chunks, providing answers to enable students to self-mark, no expectation at all on teachers for any live stream teaching, and indeed initially we didn't really push teachers recording themselves either. And that was kind of deliberate. I call it the triage phase of implementation. Obviously, we had some teachers over-delivering, some teachers innovating. We knew there were flaws in our initial offer, but we wanted time to explore our initial knowledge and beliefs about the challenges facing students and teachers and parents, and to collect lots of data. Well, not lots, but relevant data. So we surveyed our teachers, we surveyed our parents, we rang home disadvantaged families to understand their specific barriers and solutions. And we did our best to monitor engagement with what was initially, like I said, a fairly simplistic approach to remote teaching. So how many children were engaging with it before we tried to do anything more sophisticated? We were doing that because we felt that if we went straight to all bells and whistles remote teaching approach, we risked overwhelming teachers and indeed potentially students. And we risked widening the gap if our final remote teaching offer was inaccessible to the most disadvantaged students in our community. And we collected more data initially, as there were many unknowns. How many students were engaging with the basic offer, participating, doing the work? What were our individual teachers' home working capacities and arrangements, childcare barriers, other issues? And we didn't know how long schools were going to be closed for. We still don't. So taking a phased approach, simple first, scale up later, meant that we could periodically evaluate how things were going and scale up our investment as we went along. Further on, explore. The guidance report from the EF talks about making an evidence-informed adoption decision to address our problems. This is all about getting beyond the surface, beyond the headlines. Metacognition is good, feedback is good, to sort of, well, what would feedback look like for remote teaching, and how would you scaffold metacognitive strategies via a remote teaching approach? It's about looking at multiple sources of evidence, avoiding cherry-picking headline studies just to support your existing views, and checking that whatever you do fits your school, your students, and is feasible and achievable. So we looked at quite a range of guidance. I'm just going to signpost to you briefly. We looked at the EEF's rapid evidence assessment on remote teaching, and we're interested that it basically said that the method of teaching is more important than the medium. So not much to go on between live and asynchronous delivery. Well, we looked at the using digital technology guidance report, not particularly popular compared to things like metacognition, but it said similar things really. Recommendation 1 talked about considering how technology will improve teaching and learning before introducing it. So we were quite glad we hadn't just jumped straight into Loom or Zoom or live delivery, etc. Because the recommendation in more detail talked about making sure you understand the pedagogical rationale for what you're doing, because the principles of good use of technology are not distinct from questions about how to teach effectively or how students learn best. We, of course, looked at the metacognition guidance, studying very carefully what it had to say on the use of worked examples and other scaffolds, other forms of bridging for students to new content. And we looked at what the metacognition guide had to say about supporting students for planning, monitoring, and evaluate their learning, which subsequently underpinned how we structured students' work. And we looked at supporting parents to support children's learning, which particularly for children of secondary age and their parents emphasizes not to expect parents to be experts, but to support parents again to help students to self-regulate. And so we offering information to our parents was very much in that vein, because you have to obviously bring your parents on board to have a hope with remote teaching. So we looked at all of those guidance reports and others. And from that, we started to make an adoption decision where we said, well, when we scale up e-learning, as we called it, remote teaching, from our initial triage offer, we're going to need to focus and prioritize on the quality of explanation and modeling that we deliver for remote teaching. We're going to have to make sure that there's a quality formative assessment taking place through things like Google quizzes or other tools, so that we know how the students are doing, what they've learned and what they haven't learned. And we're going to have to offer feedback, and we settle on whole class feedback specific to the students and enabling to move their learning on and resulting in them doing more work than it took to set the feedback. If we move on to the next stage in the implementation guide cycle, we started to prepare for what was essentially scale up from an initial sticking plaster solution. And this is all about generating plans. So we thought about, well, why are we doing what we're doing? Well, what's it going to be? How are we going to do it? How well are we going to do it? And what will be our measures, our success criteria? So we defined all of those up front. A key thing that comes out of the implementation guides from the EF is the concept of active ingredients, which are really a best bet for effective implementation. Active ingredients are the essential behaviors or activities that you will see from stakeholders, teachers, parents, students, when a change is working as intended. So we work quite hard to define what those would be for an enhanced remote teaching offer. And we define these in a document called What Makes Great Remote Teaching at Notre Dame. So this is our own definition of essentially remote teaching pedagogy and like a minimum set of standards or behaviors that we wanted out of our teachers. And then we trained and communicated those essential behaviors very rigorously with our teachers to generate common understanding. The whole planning sequence kind of stems from these active ingredients, making sure that you've picked the right implementation activities that will deliver the active ingredients, and building your monitoring and your evaluation around those things. Then move on to selecting the right blend of activities for an implementation. Now, there were many, but I just wanted to highlight two that I think are really relevant. If you're going for a staged approach to remote teaching, or indeed any change, it enables you the option of piloting change. So while we were getting ready to scale up from our triage offer, we were piloting what we thought the next stage would look like with certain teaching groups and certain teachers, and learning as we went along. I stuck myself in to that experience because, of course, then we're walking the walk. We also very early on, before we started scaling up and making things more advanced, formed an implementation team, a sounding board featuring middle leaders and classroom teachers and some support staff. And that generated really excellent challenge, both in terms of whether we had the right active ingredients, but also whether we were going to overload teachers with our new plans. At that stage, you get to the point when you've got a plan that you can assess your readiness for a change. And the EF suggests that that's a combination of motivation of stakeholders for a change, a school's general capacity for change, and a school's innovation-specific capacity for change. In our case, when we made that readiness assessment, we actually decided that we weren't quite ready and we needed to hold for a bit. That was just before the holidays. So we didn't actually move out of our initial sticking plaster solution for remote teaching until after the Easter holidays, because our middle leaders told us that they felt staff needed time to recharge and absorb our initial training before we went for it. And in retrospect, we're glad we've done that now that we're 2 months into remote teaching. So when you've assessed readiness, you basically either decide you're ready and start practically preparing, or you pause or revise the plan or go back to the start. In our case, it was just pause. We need a bit of breathing space. But after Easter, we were able to practically prepare. So we did some upfront training of our teachers and relevant support staff. And we also put in place other things, which I'll talk about later, to ensure that teachers had ongoing support and challenge. And it wasn't just a sort of inset style one-off input under the name of professional development for our changes. So back to the cycle, and now talking more about delivery. Delivery is nicely coined by a quote from the implementation guide on the screen in the black outline box, which I'm just going to pause and let you read. So a vulnerable phase, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, recording yourself like this, or even worse, live teaching, using technologies we haven't used before, it feels uncomfortable, it feels vulnerable. And I think we have to recognize that as schools delivering remote teaching, it's important to support our teachers through that process and not just throw the kitchen sink at them and assume they'll be okay. So in terms of delivery, going back to this idea that remote teaching requires teacher professional development, not only did we do upfront training, but we put in place structures to provide ongoing support, coaching, follow-up support, collaboration, further expert input, and the kind of things that are at the moment the best bets for teacher continuous professional development. So things you'll read about in the Developing Great Teaching meta-analysis. Now, appreciably, Fletcher, Wood and Sims have made some really good challenge recently about just how reliable those current best bets for teacher CPD are, but still, we went with them. They are still the current best bets. So what did we put in place? Well, we set up basic things like twice weekly live Zoom sessions for teachers where they, called Remote Teaching Support Line, where they could connect with anything they wanted to ask, and people like myself and other members of my team were on hand. That allowed us to generate a sort of growing FAQs document, but also just to provide reassurance. We also took on a couple of people using our existing coaching capacity where we knew that or could see that teachers needed that level of support. Delivery is often described as expect problems, look for them, and then fix them. Sorry, not fit them. Typo on my slides. So we knew, and surely we all know, that remote teaching was not going to go smoothly. It's a massive step change in what we're doing, a massive learning curve for teachers. We made sure that we were generating the right sort of implementation data so that we could monitor. So yes, we did, and we do, go into our individual teachers' Google Classrooms on a regular basis to look at the quality of work set. That's done very much from a developmental point of view and not a sort of gotcha, catching people out point of view. So we're offering quite regular feedback in a supportive way to our individual teachers. We're also generating data on student engagement. So now that we've started to put formative assessment points in a systematic way, we're using the completion of formative assessment as a real handle on whether students are participating or not. And that data, which is regularly flowing to us now, allows us to coherently implement remote teaching together with pastoral leaders. So our heads of year are able to look at that data at their convenience, they're emailed it automatically, and we're able to follow up and continue to liaise with parents and students to understand what are the barriers to learning, not in a sort of telling them off, setting remote detentions or something weird, but genuinely in order to spot problems with engagement or completion of work and fix it. And that's quite interesting. Our initial surveying of parents suggested we had a small number of people who had problems accessing digital learning, but that kind of monitoring highlighted other problems where parents didn't initially see it as a problem, but it was a problem, and we've been able to provide more support with that. For example, widening how many people we send paper copies of resources home to. Sustaining now. With regards, I've forgotten something, sorry, go back. The other thing about delivering is it talks about providing a motivating, encouraging leadership approach initially, but not letting teachers stray away from the essential behaviors as you've defined them and shared them with teachers until you have a stable approach. Okay, with regards to the sustain phase, another quote for you that I'll just shut up and let you read. I think this is really relevant to both the sustain phase and the previous delivery phase. At the same time as developing remote teaching, we, of course, like everyone else, were managing childcare for the vulnerable and critical worker children throughout the holidays, throughout the bank holidays, all of that, fun and games, and the ongoing uncertainty and planning and prep and stretch around phased reopening of schools. In our case, years 10 and 12, but in our MAT, of course, our primary schools, multiple year groups all at once at a very ridiculous time frame. So we had to be aware with our remote teaching that we needed to help teachers to manage those competing priorities, all incredibly important, but potentially likely to break each other unless we made them cohere together and work together. So a key principle we've started to develop is, for example, that our year 10, 12 face-to-face or on-site work must complement rather than compete or duplicate or relegate our remote teaching strategy. In terms of individual bits of the sustain phase guidance from the EF, one step is about planning and sustaining for a sustained approach by scaling in innovation. So fortunately, we'd already thought we'd do that. And as I said, we started off in a triage phase, and then we judged readiness before we put in place more sophisticated or enhanced e-learning provision, remote teaching provision, initially just for years 10 and 12. So we prioritized. And then we evaluated readiness again, speaking to middle leaders, classroom teachers, students, parents, before offering that enhanced provision to all year groups and all students, which is where we are now. And then we're thinking of phase 4 of our approach as blending our remote teaching with on-site provision for years 10 and 12. We're probably going to be doing that in just over a week as I record this. So by the time people watch my research-led Norwich presentation, we'll probably be in the thick of it. But being able to identify these phases and plan to reevaluate readiness at each stage rather than assuming that readiness is still there weeks or months later, we feel is really important, and from the guidance, an evidence-informed approach. Treating each of those steps as a new process is important. And like I said, being prepared to pause, to delay until people are ready. Also, in some cases, asking the question, is the problem still the same as it was 2 months ago? And if it isn't, going back to the explore stage and starting again. We've actually had to do that because initially in the explore phase, we said, well, no live delivery. It's going to put too much stress on parents and teachers. We'd be better off with asynchronous delivery for the flexibility it delivers. But with year 10 and 12 soon to be coming on site, we've actually said, well, actually, that is a form of live delivery. So we've had to go back to explore and say, well, some elements of remote teaching are going to be live because kids are going to be in a classroom. So let's see if we can stream that as well, so that we don't lock out children who can't come back on site or who don't want to come back on site yet, so that there is equity of access for all students. So to sum up, being prepared to go back to the beginning of an implementation process when you scale up, and not assume that your problems remain the same and your barriers remain the same throughout the process. I think this is really important, although I'm sure it's obvious and I don't want to teach you how to suck eggs. Part of sustaining a change is about continuously acknowledging, supporting, and rewarding good implementation practice. So acknowledging to our teachers that juggling remote teaching, if they're volunteering with it, childcare provision on site for the vulnerable and the critical worker children, as well as contributing to the school partially reopening, is crucial. Celebrating good practice by, for example, having mechanisms for teachers to share with one another peer-to-peer, and just continuing to verbally acknowledge their contributions at all time. I think another thing about continually acknowledging, supporting, and rewarding, some of the supports from making sure that your senior leaders, where they have a teaching load, are exemplifying and modeling for others as they go along. And we've been really careful to make sure that our senior leaders are doing just that and aren't saying one thing but doing another. Okay, so to repeat the headlines for this session, I've argued why, even though implementation is unsexy, there's still room for it in a crisis. And in fact, it's probably where we went to first in the current crisis, before starting to stick things like metacognitive strategies, feedback loops, etc. into our remote teaching provision. I've walked through key points for implementing remote teaching, stage by stage, in a phased, careful approach. And why aren't we done with implementation 2 months into the crisis? Because the goalposts keep changing, because the needs of our students may change over time. Engagement may drop. We may need to do something else. We need to make sure that we continue to ask, can our teachers cope with this? And we need to recognize that staff turnover or changes in staff roles mean that we may have readiness for a change when we initially go ahead and deliver something, but it's wrong to assume that that capacity remains indefinitely. So will you need to train new staff in September on your remote teaching strategy and the tools and techniques? Unfortunately, probably yes. It's probably time we started planning for that now. Some closing questions I hope you'll find useful. Is there still a place for evidence-informed implementation in your school, even in a crisis? Are the issues relating to remote teaching, as seen by teachers, pupils and parents, still the same now as they were in April? Do you need to revisit the evidence base around remote teaching and consider your approach in light of this? Reconsider, sorry. And how will you help your staff to balance what are potentially competing priorities: remote teaching, childcare provision, and also partial school reopening? Thank you for listening to my talk. I hope you've got to the end. If you'd like to know more, you can see our website on the screen in front of you, along with my Twitter handle and our Research School handle. It would be fantastic if you wanted to get in touch and talk more, either about implementation or the rest of the EEF's evidence base that has informed my school's remote teaching strategy. Thank you.